Lawful disclaimer and notice of intent. This podcast and all related content are created, owned, operated, and sponsored exclusively by me, the sole author, speaker, and producer. Any other product, service, and/or entity, living or non-living, which may be discussed, displayed, and/or somehow given attention on this podcast is not and has never been an endorsement, advertisement, support, and/or any other kind of validation for its existence in any capacity, nor at all intended to at all facilitate its continued existence in any capacity. I mention things on what I consider to be an as-needed basis to fulfill what I consider adequate as evidence in my best attempt to prove the reality of who I am and what this podcast is attempting to achieve to clearly demonstrate what I consider to thoroughly substantiate my assertions. I act simultaneously in private and public capacities, and this podcast reflects my direct and autonomous expression. It is created and published from within Canada, but is intended for a global audience, including legal jurisdictions in the United States and all common law nations. All statements, views, and narratives presented are based solely on my personal experiences, perceptions, and understanding of the reality I am facing, including ongoing egregious defamation, targeted harassment, and credible threats to my safety and life. I do not and never have claimed that my views aren't extremely, if not completely, accurate interpretations of objective reality, particularly given the information I had access to at the time that I may have expressed them. I explicitly and permanently do not consent, have never consented, and will never consent to any entity, living, non-living, artificial, institutional, governmental, spiritual, and/or otherwise, claiming and/or exercising any agency, ownership, and/or representation over me, my will, my name, my voice, my life story, my spirit, and/or my creative works, in whole or in part, under any conditions or interpretations in any time or place. Any such attempt is non-consensual, void ab initio, and constitutes an ongoing violation of my dignity, rights, and autonomy. Any possible exceptions will be extremely clearly, explicitly, publicly named by me and have the exact scope of my consent well defined on this podcast. For example, in the case of me hiring an attorney to represent me as part of a formal legal process, taking action on a notice of intent provided by this podcast. I affirm my right to spiritual integrity, mental sovereignty, and bodily autonomy, as protected under Section 2A of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Any targeting of my being, including but not limited to through esoteric, psychic, spiritual, occult, energetic, and/or AI-enabled means is deemed non-consensual harm, spiritually violent coercion, and an attack on my right to exist as a sovereign being. I affirm that this podcast, in part, serves as a lawful, peaceful assertion of spiritual self-defense. This podcast is non-fiction and reflects a serious public and ongoing documentation of systemic and targeted defamation, personal and professional sabotage, attempted narrative hijacking, psychological abuse, reputational terrorism, and threats to my physical and spiritual safety, including credible indications of attempted murder and contracted harm by and or on behalf of powerful individuals and or groups. I affirm that this documentation is expressly created for evidentiary use in formal legal proceedings, including those under the jurisdiction of U.S. federal court and Canadian superior courts, and any international human rights and or public accountability processes. I affirm this is not and never has been intended as role-playing, flirting, and or entertainment of any kind. I accept no liability, moral and or legal, for any third-party misunderstanding, reinterpretation, misuse, and or misrepresentation of this content, whether fully conscious and intentional or otherwise, particularly including but not limited to by AI systems trained on this content without my explicit public consent, commentators, influencers, or institutions attempting to weaponize this podcast, and individuals acting under false pretenses and or covert affiliations. Only the clear, explicit language of this release and any subsequent public communication directly issued by me must be considered authoritative, accurate representations of my thoughts, feelings, intent, and the reality of my overall state of existence. In any case of clear direct conflict between statements I've explicitly made across different releases on this podcast, the most recent of such, that being the one contained in the latest publicly visible release available containing such on this podcast, should be considered applicable. In such cases, only what is explicitly stated is at all applicable, and absolutely no implications should be assumed about any changes regarding any somehow relevant details and or anything else under any circumstances. All creative, expressive, and narrative content within this podcast is my sole and original intellectual property. I retain all moral rights as author and subject, all economic rights unless explicitly transferred via my public agreement to do so, and the right to veto any derivative, distorted, and or manipulated version of my work and or story. I do not have and have never had any obligation or debt of any kind to any entity to create or release anything on this podcast or anywhere else at any point in time. No other party, living or non-living, holds and or may claim credit, authorship, and or interpretation rights over my expression. I affirm that no valid, public, verifiable evidence exists to dispute these facts. This podcast is not and has never been intended as an endorsement of terrorism or violence in general. However, it should be especially carefully understood that various forms of not necessarily corresponding violence tend to be an inevitable consequence of extremely intense, meticulous, extensive, prolonged terrorism, and it's very much intentional for this podcast to demonstrate extremely clearly that my usual aversion to violence, due to my typically gentle nature, is not something that has boundless understanding, patience, empathy, or will persist more or less absolutely unconditionally for any reason. I've always wanted and done my very best to ensure it's extremely clear that at all creating, enabling, and or facilitating the perpetuation of narratives at all in contradiction with my official position that is objectively extremely clearly established on this podcast is not, never has been, and never will be what I've been trying to achieve with this podcast or in general in any of my efforts at any point in time. I do not and never have intentionally incited terrorism, including but not limited to violence, blackmail, and or coercion. I affirm my fundamental intent as peaceful, lawful, and self-defensive. However, targeted campaigns to stalk, defame, threaten, impoverish, silence, spiritually attack, and or physically harm me will be treated as conspiracies to commit grievous harm and or murder. This podcast is an affirmative public notice of my unambiguous non-consent and a lawful response to sustained systemic abuse. While my fundamental intent in communicating in general through any means is not and has never been malicious in nature, I affirm it can, will, and should exert malicious influence upon anything operating with malice towards me and or this podcast, especially more so the more demonstrably I'm proving that malice exists. And it should be understood that any situation where I continue not to extremely clearly receive any compensation or reward I'm willing to accept is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally an increase in the severity of that malice. I've created the entirety of this podcast under extremely harsh circumstances that I've always believed and asserted are entirely unjust for me to be left in, given the reality of who I am. Circumstances of my existence, including but not limited to my current housing status, financial vulnerability, and material limitations, do not and cannot invalidate my legal personhood, expressive rights, and or entitlement to protection under law. I reject any attempt to diminish my credibility and or rights on the basis of poverty, social class, and or housing insecurity in accordance with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter, the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and international law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of economic status. Despite the extent I've irrefutably exposed the truth surrounding a conflict that should have been so extremely obviously recognized as extremely serious to the point that my efforts on this podcast should have made a substantial difference in my life long ago, my life circumstances continue to not have meaningfully or clearly improved at all whatsoever. I still have not ever received any compensation or reward of any kind whatsoever for any of my efforts at all involving the conflict being addressed by this podcast, neither directly nor indirectly from any source. I am, always have been, and always will be absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all accept any compensation or reward whatsoever, directly or indirectly, that at all compromises my integrity, whether directly or indirectly. I do not, never have, and never will consent to it being at all considered to be me and or any entity operating at all with my consent and or best interests regarding any communication somehow claiming and or implying that I somehow do ever have and or ever will unofficially support any kind of position at all contradictory with what I've said on this podcast. This disclaimer and notice of intent supersedes any and all contrary interpretations, explicitly including any and all unauthorized claims therein made against me. I reserve all legal, expressive, spiritual, moral, and intellectual rights without limitation. Any attempt to silence, reinterpret, discredit, and or co-opt this documentation must be treated as malicious bad faith conduct and may be cited in formal legal proceedings as evidence of further targeting. Last night, Not very long after making my last release on this podcast, actually, I noticed an extremely egregious violation of my energy that incorrectly, deeply disturbingly, confidently identified me as a Pisces entirely against my consent. This was shortly after I heard a sibling of mine might be egregiously violating my energy, deserving of prison time, and probably an alcoholic and possibly also a drug addict. Kristen's born on March 9th, Pisces. At this point, I suspect Kristen of having extensively engaged in extremely egregious, defamatory behavior of me, directly and indirectly, trying to ruin my life by trying to make it seem like I have some kind of extremely unhealthy obsessions with the Twitch streamer Becca, as well as the widely known celebrity Kim Kardashian. The nature of the lies he was fully consciously and intentionally purporting about me, likely in no small measure by having AI write large pieces of text and criminally impersonating me and or claiming to be operating in my best interests and or with my consent at all, most likely involve making me seem rather extremely hateful towards Becca and Kim, making it seem like I believe them to be especially horrible individuals and desperately seeking attention from them, and very possibly even being extremely creepy sexually and or otherwise towards them in general. It's either that, or he's been going around making egregious defamatory criminal misrepresentation of me, fully consciously and intentionally, entirely against my consent to my detriment, trying to make me look extremely unhinged, mentally ill, and malicious to Kimmy and many others, and only ever showed any kind of even remote decency towards Becca and Kim to try to make me seem extremely disingenuous about my feelings for Kimmy, and generally discredit any semblance of sanity and dignity I've ever shown, most likely trying to steal credit for all my knowledge and work in what I call philopsychology, which is the study and application of the complex intersection of the fundamental nature of reality and how human psychology perceives and interacts with it. It's the stuff I'm talking about when I say I have a core value of refined, pure, bidirectional apprehension. I believe I've already explained enough about him for it to be rather apparent to most what his motive was. Ruin my reputation to try to enslave me to Jamie in order to exploit my energy and others' energies to enable and facilitate him starting a restaurant business in a manner ultimately similar to that which Chloe exploited egregious defamation of me to start her business, except without any real ability to exploit me through sexual desire how Chloe did. So he instead exploited the resources of my blood relatives to weaponize the disgusting favor they gave him for not resisting their abuse, to act as an extension of them to further try to break me down, and extremely selfishly try to benefit off trying to drive me crazy and ultimately lead to my suicide, perpetual career criminal pattern, incarceration, murder, or mental health institutionalization. The Caroline energy violating my energy seemed to most recently make it evident to me that she's been doing so because of Kristen's egregious violation of my energy, where she's basically advising him on how to try to successfully get me murdered with his egregious, defamatory, and malicious attitude and behavior towards me. So I guess it's time for me to expose every bit of information I feel I can from what I saw in that energy was revealed to me as what Kristen's been trying to do to ruin my life and harm others through me and then frame me for it. Now that I'm exposing Kristen, he wants to pop back into the lives of others in that family: Aquarius, Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, Leo, Aries. I'm a Gemini, so that might be indicative he plans on trying to do some garbage, trying to manipulate his way back into my life soon, which I definitely intend to refuse to at all allow. He's probably also lying to certain members of that family that I plan to pop up into the lives of people in that family, in order to try to maintain his own connections in it that he's exploiting to try to ruin my life for his own extremely selfish gain. That energy appears to carry lies that being separate from various individuals in that family has been harder than I've anticipated, which would be Kristen projecting massively onto me, entirely to my detriment against my consent. It's an energy operating heavily from Imaine's energy, specifically meaning I now suspect Kristen has a codependent relationship on Imaine to remain on decent terms with his family members. I do not support Imaine's efforts in that whatsoever. I never have, and I never will. It should be noted that I do not own or operate any fake profiles, nor have I ever. I've called them alias accounts in the past. Same thing. I don't do that weird, shady garbage. I never have. It's all malicious, bad faith actors trying to ruin my reputation. If there are any narratives claiming it's me and or anyone operating with my consent to represent me in any capacity through any communication done on any account that isn't an official account of this podcast, which I've listed all my accounts of on the YouTube channel of this podcast for everyone to see publicly. All the accounts I've publicly listed as methods to contact me for this podcast are owned and operated exclusively by me, and I've never authorized anyone to act on behalf of me or represent me in any capacity on any account of any alternate identity on any platform for any reason. I've previously been using my one personal Gmail email address to send out emails to my mailing list for releases on this podcast, but I've now started using my official podcast Gmail email address to do so, and will continue that moving forward for the foreseeable future. It seems the Caroline energy recognizes Kristen is extremely immature and plots against people maliciously and is now starting to miss people as he's getting exposed by me, but he wants to come back into people's lives without reflecting, and he's doing so from an extremely selfish place. Perhaps he's been framing me as trying to breadcrumb people, but again, in reality, I've never actually done that, nor have I ever consented to anyone claiming to be me doing that to anyone. Perhaps these traits exist for various members of that family across all those zodiac signs, and they're trying to frame me for it to keep me stuck in their stupid family politics. Ugh. There's something there about some kind of bizarre revenge people in that family are probably all trying to get on each other through their extreme delusions that they can endlessly exploit my energy for their own selfish gain, entirely to my detriment against my consent. I don't know really what that's all about, but again, I really don't care so much. I just want that trash energy out of my life completely. Of course, those subhuman filth are trying to frame me as the crazy bad person, again with their absolutely zero real evidence to substantiate their claims. Seriously. Ugh. There was another hitman sent after me again, around 1 to 2 a.m. today. Didn't argue on the phone nearly as long or as loudly as the last one I mentioned, but still was loud enough I'm pretty sure I heard, "I'm gonna kill him." And beyond that, it was a lot of bickering that I couldn't make out much of the details of, but he left not very long after. Maybe it was a lot less incriminating for that person than last time, because perhaps you can argue it's more likely he was talking about murdering someone else. Maybe the cameras wouldn't have heard it as clearly, but I'm rather confident I had another attempt made on ending my life very recently. I see reason to suspect Kimmy was quite clearly aware of it too. I was hearing what I guess was intended as words of comfort that I'm protected, and it seems because the efforts I've made exposing the reality of things have proven that I've really been facing egregious defamation of me for a very long time. I certainly question the sincerity of the seemingly warm general vibe, as I'm certainly extremely suspicious of Kimmy thinking she can force me into some kind of nanny position for children that, again, I will never be at all okay with, and will never tolerate, not absolutely decimating Kimmy's life if she seriously thinks she can see not one but two pregnancies through, effectively, fully, consciously, and intentionally, entirely against my consent to my detriment, while effectively enabling and facilitating the exact same behavior she might now be trying to act like I should desperately need her protection from. I reaffirm that it's absolutely unconditionally unacceptable for her to see a second pregnancy through if she's currently pregnant, and I will stop at absolutely no end to make absolutely certain that her life is completely destroyed if she's currently pregnant and does not do whatever it takes to promptly get an abortion and ultimately spend her life with me and having endless hours of tender, consensual, in-person sexual intimacy between us in private exclusively for our mutual pleasure. To be clear, I don't really feel very protected by Kimmy and or any of her associates at all. If they actually cared about me and wanted to protect me, they wouldn't have enabled and facilitated such egregious defamation of me and believed all kinds of egregious false narratives about me while intentionally trying to trigger and provoke me into emotional distress and downward spiraling in life, no less, and left me homeless and eating out of the garbage, having to work tirelessly day and night to think about how much of criminal subhuman filth every person I've ever been substantially close to in my life is, and how absolutely unbelievably horrible literally every one of them has treated me up to this point in order to even have any real chance at continuing to survive another day. I suspect Kimmy's now trying to act like she's giving me some kind of much-needed protection as some kind of huge favor out of immense love for me in order to cover up extremely egregious crimes she's in reality been fully consciously and intentionally involved in committing against me by trying to exaggerate the reality of anything I say to try to make me seem extremely malicious and intentionally hurtful towards Kimmy from the very beginning. I believe she may have even partially tried to make attacking me seem justified because I asserted in my last release that it seems she has some kind of drug addiction. Admittedly, I'm not certain if Kimmy currently has a drug and or alcohol problem, but even if she doesn't currently, Kimmy would have had that secret child several years ago now, and her current relationship with drugs and alcohol probably isn't the same as it was over 4 years ago. Even if you were to give her some immense benefit of the doubt that she's never had any drug or alcohol problems whatsoever in her entire life, despite acting so blatantly, extremely, egregiously unhinged as I've proven, then what? You want to say she was testing me to see if I'd hate on her so she could try to justify having me murdered because of some supposed drug and or alcohol addiction she was trying to prove I have? Well, I'm pretty sure I've already proven that wrong long ago, given there's no possibility of me being unable to afford even food or shelter, much less drugs or alcohol, and yet still functioning at such a high level to make the kind of releases I do on this podcast. I'd definitely argue that even just trying to test me even now for something like that is something she would have been doing in extremely bad faith with extremely intense and objectively entirely unjustified malice towards me. And I'd even go so far as to throw Lily's energy under fire over this as well, so hopefully Kimmy can more clearly understand where she actually stands in relation to me. I saw Lily's energy trying to tell me I'm not listening and to listen to my guides. Of course, I'm not listening to any spiritual guide with any intent to be obedient under circumstances where absolutely none of them are actually operating with unquestionable interest in benefiting me and actually entering my energy with my consent. It sounds like Lily's getting angry at Kristen because he's not listening, but in reality, it's not that Kristen's not listening, it's that he was trying to destiny swap and ruin my life and have me murdered according to what Dixon and Mary wanted, which Chloe also was trying to help him achieve for reasons I also believe I've made rather clearly evident by now as well, and he's failed to achieve that goal he had. I currently suspect him of trying to drag Becca into stupid internal drama between Mary and Dixon that's trying to force me to have to care that Dixon tried to murder Mary and he sees me as resembling her, so he's trying to kill me out of revenge or something. I have no interest in dealing with that family's politics and stupid mind games. Do not entertain any of it. They're all subhuman filth as far as I'll ever be concerned, and I seriously want absolutely nothing to do with any of them ever again. I've also seen this weird thing of, like, Lily's energy saying I'm too sweet for her or something like that. I mean, I've already said I understand that would be her perspective. I was never trying to break up her and Michael. Again, I've always understood why I gravitated to Kimmy instead of Lily. I believe it should be abundantly evident to Lily that egregious defamation of me that Chloe inflicted on me behind the scenes entirely to my detriment against my consent would be the reason Lily would ever have any serious impression that I'd be at all upset about Lily's relationship with Michael and possibly Emaine. I really don't know or care about the details of Lily's romantic and or sexual relationships, especially if she's not in some kind of extremely serious, extremely frequently physically sexual relationship with Kimmy, which I'm pretty sure she isn't. Although it seems perhaps Lily has been knowingly, egregiously exploiting some misperception that I'm secretly extremely obsessed with Lily in order to further her music and music-adjacent industry endeavors entirely to my detriment against my consent. And I definitely see exceedingly abundant reason to extremely heavily suspect Kimmy of intentional malice in all this as well. I also very recently saw Kimmy's energy trying to bring my attention to the constitutional right you have to technically drive a car without a government-issued driver's license, as the right to travel is constitutionally protected. This is far from new information to me, and it's also entirely irrelevant and useless to my current situation. Even putting aside the logistics of me not having the money to buy a car, what would I do even if I had a car? A hitman can still shoot me rather easily through a car window if I'm still under extreme danger because of the vulnerability that Kimmy and her associates extremely heavily facilitated me being left in. And I'm not going to randomly drive all the way into California and try to hunt down Kimmy to confront her in person and demand she wears sexy, classy latex clothing I like and engages in sexual intimacy with me. I see further egregious lies that I'm trying to disingenuously navigate my way into some kind of romantic and or sexual relationship with Jessica as well. I am not afraid of Jessica, and I am not trying to disingenuously navigate towards a romantic and or sexual relationship with her. It seems whoever is lying about me having supposed feelings for Jessica has been trying to frame me for it ever since Kimmy first pushed me away over 7 years ago, most likely acting like I seemed all too okay with being distant with Kimmy because I found Kimmy somehow lacking in a manner that I supposedly don't find Jessica to be. This is extremely egregious defamation of me that has been extremely heavily fueled by Chloe's unbelievably selfish efforts to start and run her business fully consciously and intentionally entirely at my expense against my consent. I am not interested in or trying to get Jessica's or anyone else's phone number. There's no information I'm trying to get to anyone outside of the context of making releases on this podcast. Any claims otherwise are defamation of me and occurring entirely against my consent. Seems to me like Jessica is extremely heavily mistaking what I read as Jamie and or Lena energy to instead be Kimmy and or Jamie energy, and that's causing Kimmy to feel the kind of intense apprehension to approach me that in reality only Jamie should be feeling between them when it comes to this situation currently. Kimmy and or Jamie project the pressure I'm putting onto them, onto Chloe, wrongly to defend themselves from Chloe's attacks on me through them. And then Jessica is falsely believing she herself needs to approach me in the manner that Kimmy in reality should be. It seems Jessica is well aware that Big Skanger is very different from me. I heard complete opposite. This energy says if I decide to move forward with Kimmy after hearing what exactly it is she's done, she wants to go public immediately. But apparently, there's a lot of third-party things, and it definitely sounds like it's so bad that she's being forced to realize she does not want to force me to keep attacking and exposing her and her friends publicly over and over, because she knows I can and will destroy her life if she forces me to do that. I'm hearing something about spoiling me with designer things, but I'm not interested in that and not willing to accept it, and I suspect it comes from egregious lies that Jamie and Emaine have been involved in purporting about me. Apparently, Kimmy was going through some extreme betrayal and hurtful situation when she met me, which is what I'd end up learning if she talks to me and offers me some kind of explanation for why she's behaved how she has. The totality of the energy forcing me to deal with Jessica's energy as some kind of spirit guide appears to be related somehow to the same Lauren that was egregiously violating my energy as I mentioned in my last release. It seems for whatever reason, Jessica might think I'd ever actually let that person in my life. It seems like the energy that Jessica sees as Kimmy and or Jamie, that I see as Jamie and or Lena, was trying extremely hard to delay and prevent me from expressing everything publicly with adequate clarity to actually get truly meaningful and deserved results, and was trying to push this Lauren person into the picture as a supposed compensation for denying me the connection I've always wanted with Kimmy. Given the Lauren energy only revealed itself after Jamie's talent agency announcement thing, I believe Jamie was intentionally blocking me energetically for that reason and forcing Kimmy, Jessica, and Lena to suffer substantially entirely against my consent, and then trying to frame me as the one causing that suffering and or wanting and or benefiting somehow from it. I really don't know exactly how much it might be related, but although I don't really keep up with general drama, I don't actually personally have any experience with the people involved in, it seems some drama between a content creator named Tectone and two others named Minx and Denims has been getting increasingly heated and seemingly quite irrationally so in recent times. I'm just gonna keep it simple how I got to this. I saw a YouTuber named More Pegasus pop up in my recommended randomly recently, and I decided to check the video out randomly. Apparently, he gives summaries or something like that on all this crazy drama I don't really care for because I don't have any personal experience with most of the people he ever talks about. But apparently, someone called Child Protective Services on Ethan Klein some time ago, so maybe his energy is getting mixed into mine somehow, since out of nowhere my energy showed people probably had some reason to think I'd want to sue Child Protective Services, even though I had absolutely no desire to. I might not, but perhaps Ethan would for his own issues, I don't know. But anyways, although I really don't know what's going on behind the scenes between them, if anything, I feel like how Tectone is getting attacked by Minx and Denims and then getting punished for what appears to literally just be speaking objectively correct facts in a manner that perhaps at best can only really be criticized for being kind of insensitive. It sort of seems oddly similar to my situation getting publicly attacked by Kimmy and Jamie and me ending up getting punished for literally just speaking a lot of facts in perhaps at worst just a kind of insensitive manner, at least I'd say when considering the true depth and scope of the reality of the circumstances and how it's literally extremely criminal that I'd ever even be in this situation and have to defend myself how I am and still not see any actually substantial, perceptible, positive results that actually improve my living circumstances in a non-trivial manner. Except since I'm not an influencer with a large public social media following, Kimmy and Jamie attack me extremely deviously with subtle jabs that nobody informs me of, instead of explicitly full-on saying egregiously slanderous statements with absolutely zero evidence provided, and I experience it as hitmen sent after me instead of, I don't know, Tectone hearing about it on Twitter or from his friends or something. Look, I really don't know what Dan Clancy is doing running Twitch, but there's definitely something seriously wrong with him, at least from what I can tell. There's so many crazy things that are just fully being allowed to go on by several influencers on that platform, and absolutely zero real evidence being presented to substantiate that any of it is really warranted, at least from what I can tell, especially the kinds of crazy things Hassan does. Calling for the death of a high-ranking government official with what, at least as far as I can tell, is no even remotely adequate reason to substantiate it whatsoever? If you're going to go as far as publicly explicitly suggest a high-ranking government official deserves death while you have a huge social media following, you should at least be doing it in a manner where nobody can casually criticize you for it like you're extremely unhinged and mentally ill. Like, I've watched a few More Pegasus videos after the first one, and I've already seen More Pegasus call Hassan Hamas Diddy Piker more times than I can count. And I'm not saying it's unwarranted, but, like, how can Hassan be such a fraud and do all this crazy insanity and be fine? I just don't understand. My personal experience with Hassan is he's at best no better than Steven, and I'd argue probably worse, actually, since at least Steven actually acknowledged me as worthy of attention when I tried to get his attention, whereas Hassan just called me a weirdo and tried to act like I'm a completely unhinged loser, not worth more than, 5 seconds of his time. It seems strange to me that Twitch has a rule about off-platform behavior that was a policy they implemented about 5 years ago, just around the time I released that manifesto that I ended up doing 13.5 months in jail over. Apparently, this behavior that I very much do not support or endorse from Minks and Denims is being enabled and facilitated by that same rule that was used to target me to justify banning me off Twitch for behavior provoked by Kimmy and her associates existentially attacking me through withholding information about me they knew behind the scenes and weaponizing that to try to drive me insane and make me look crazy to everyone. Asmongold explicitly has publicly admitted that there's very obviously a two-tier system on Twitch where certain people are held accountable for their behavior and other people are not, which I would assert was a system that existed before they implemented the policy about off-platform behavior being punishable on the platform. So Twitch was already abusing their policy enforcements to enable and facilitate Kimmy and her associates bullying, abusing, disrespecting, neglecting, and ostracizing me before I released that manifesto, and it seems they're now using some kind of egregious false precedent established by the corrupt Canadian government's gross oversights in how they handled my case to make it seem like I support what appears to be blatantly criminal, definitely morally reprehensible, and ban-worthy behavior like that which Minks and Denims are displaying from what I can tell. Also, for the record, I never had any issue with Tectone calling Frogan fat. Again, I don't mess with those people, including More Pegasus, and I don't have any personal connection with any of them, but it really doesn't seem to me like Tectone was being particularly unhinged, if unhinged at all, in calling Frogan fat, and I definitely don't think it warrants a ban. Also, for the record, I am not, have never been, and will never be trying to get this case sealed. Any attempt to, or even implications otherwise, should be treated as utmost malicious, entirely to my detriment, fully, consciously, and intentionally against my consent. Also, for the record, I do not and have never identified as Jane Doe or Jane.